talk about Europe. We are in Europe. I'm really feel European, like most of you, I guess. Um, and I will be talking about European competitiveness, about the difficult coexistence of industrial policy and competition policy, and finally, the way we do European industrial policy in Europe. So that will be the outline. And okay, thank you. So things that you all know is, we're way behind. You have all read Draghi's report and many other reports. Hourly productivity is one third less than the US, mainly driven by tech, by the way. We face high energy costs. Education is not on par with the Asian countries. If you look at the PISA ranking, our universities, I'm afraid, is not on par with the Anglo-Saxon one. And of course, we face brain drain, we face fiscal competition. Actually, even within Europe, we face fiscal competition. So it's a difficult thing. We have relatively few spillovers from educational institutions. We have brains. I mean, if you look at, we still have, I should say, still have brains. In some areas of research, we still do quite well, but that doesn't translate into startups. I mean, there are lots of startups, battery, the top ones. It's true also that at school, you don't, I had no class as trained as mathematician engineer. I had no class in entrepreneurship. And I think it has been going on like this. Not that we don't have entrepreneurs, but we are not trained to be entrepreneurs. It's a bit different. I will insist on labor market institutions later on. And finally, that has been in 200 reports, but most clearly in the Letta report, but also the Draghi report, we don't have a single market. I mean, this single market thing is just doesn't exist. We have 27 labor markets, labor laws, public procurement processes, financial regulation, and so on. And all know the IMF study, which shows really that the non-tariff barriers are huge. So I will focus on industrial organization, so industrial and competition policies, and on the paradox. So the European innovation deficit is everywhere, except in the domestic political debate. I mean, just my home country, for example, you never talk about innovation. We have had lots of election. This is not a topic that is of any interest to. More generally, I would say, all the time bombs, those things that take a long-term view have disappeared from the political debate, and that's disastrous. Europe has none of the top 20 tech market caps, none of the top 20 startups. As you all know, Europe has all firms. We don't have the Googles of this world. We spend 1/6 of US companies on tech, in the tech R&D, and we offer a low rate of return on venture capital. The American venture capitalists are in Europe. That's not the issue, but they don't necessarily find the rate of return they want. And the implication is, of course, a loss of purchasing power, a loss of good jobs, what Draghi has called the slow agony, low innovation, low productivity growth, low purchasing power growth, so a lot of frustration. And of course, something which is newer, I guess. I mean, not that new, actually, but of course, it has been amplified with the Ukraine war and Trump, which is that we were deemed negligible. So, we're not even consulted for anything, and we lose in terms of sovereignty, so our bargaining power has gone down. Okay, cheer up. Why is that? Well, let me start with what I think, and you may disagree, are false explanations. The first is, there's a shortage of savings. No, I mean, Europe has a huge amount of savings. What I will say is that the savings don't always go toward, risk-taking. They go to treasury bonds, to safe corporate bonds. And part of the regulation encourages that, of course. So we have lots of savings, but perhaps of the wrong kind if we want to innovate. Lots of people will say, we don't have industrial policy. By the way, it's because of competition policy. My question there, which industrial policy? Industrial policy is multidimensional. So I'm always nervous when I hear people talk about industrial policy. So is that upstream, like what DARPA and NIH do, or is that downstream where you subsidize production? Is that targeted or non-targeted? So non-targeted is kind of classical R&D subsidies or uniform tariffs or whatever, but then targeted will be focusing on some industry, some technology, or some firm. So what are we talking about here? It's unclear. Shortage of entrepreneurs, I say, I don't think so. I mean, there's no reason why we have different genes, entrepreneurial genes in Europe. Then you have people who say, there's too much regulation. We are fed up with regulation. And of course, some of that is true. I mean, you know, the normative impact of not only the European Commission, but also the member state regulations is huge. But we need regulation for the common good. So just putting regulations, in the same basket makes no sense whatsoever. And then in France, you would say there's too much austerity, which is, in the case of France, is always a little bit funny, of course. But it was very interesting, actually. I don't know about your home countries, but when the Draghi report came out, which is an excellent report, I have some criticism, but it's an excellent report. People, instead of commenting what was really in the report, they commented only in France, almost only the 800 billion euros more. And some people said it's wonderful at the end of austerity. And then some others said it's a disaster. We are going to go bankrupt. That was the focus of the thing. And I think that was just a wrong thing. First, we agree on a project, and then we finance it. We don't start French way by financing the stuff and then wondering what we do with the money, because you are quite sure that you'll do the wrong thing with the money in that case. So first, we should have a project and then find the money. The opposite thing is a mistake. So why is Europe way behind innovation? Well, Europe spends less on R&D. It's well known. We had in 2000, we had the Lisbon agenda, most 3% I don't remember, 2010 or something like that. We are still at 2%, by the way, on average, with lots of differences across countries. And when you look at, this is from a report I wrote with people from Bocconi and Munich, like Daniel Gross and Clement Faust, it's not due to the public sector. The public sector is about 0.7% of GDP. In Europe and in the US, the big difference is the private sector, which invests twice as much in the US. Okay, so US, just to take US, has invests much more, but this is because of the private sector. But that's one thing. But the other thing is that it spends the money on incremental as opposed to disruptive reputation. So that's what in a report we call the European mid-tech trap. Just to give you an example, the private R&D effort in the US is about 85% tech. In Europe, it's about 50% mid-tech, including 1/3, which is on automobile, which is amazing. I mean, this is not the safe industry. It's not an industry on which we are going to make a lot of money and create jobs. That's where we spend the money in Europe, on automobiles. Even so, now we are way behind the Chinese. So, and not to mention Tesla. This is very scary. I'm scared. There are low markups, and we are exposed to disruptive innovation. Okay, now we live in a new world, and I think that some people, I mean, you in this room have understood that, but many people don't understand we are in a new world. People in France or in many other countries in Europe, but also in Japan and Korea and so on, there was a catch-up phase. 30 years, by the way, China did the same more recently. There is a catch-up phase. What do you need for a catch-up phase? Well, you need competent, well-meaning civil servants who are going to organize things so as to build the manufacturing plants, the power plants, the highways, the housing you need, and so on. What had to be done was pretty well known. And you just need to have some planners who are going to do the right thing. And the growth, in all those countries, the growth happened. Now it may create a lobby against in favor of the catch-up industries, as usual, whenever you encourage something. And it may be a bit more difficult now to keep on with the catch-up strategy. China has been doing extremely well with that, but there is one sector one industry where they put a huge amount of money and didn't work because they didn't have the alliances to import the knowledge. So semiconductor is the example of in mind. Now we are in different world with the technological frontier. So now we need different skills. We don't need the conscientious, well-meaning civil servant. We need to have disruptive, risk-taking talents. And by the way, humble decision makers, and I would say economists as well. For me, a good example of industrial policy is what happened with vaccines. BARDA basically chose six teams. There were three technologies. They said, we don't know which one is going to win. Actually, the messenger RNA was not the favorite at the time. And basically, they said, we don't know. And we are going to put two teams on each technology. Now, this is not what we do in Europe or in France. Then you spread the money across 10 teams, 20 teams, 30 teams, as opposed to choosing the ones who have a chance to succeed. And being humble is really key to that. And lots of politicians and civil servants are not humble. They know what's to be done. Usually that's because they have a friend in some industry who says that's the future of the future of the country. I've gone through those meetings. I can tell you it's scary. By the way, I was an advocate for universities, so I was just one lobby among many others. But it was pretty clear in the room that nobody knew what was going on in other industries or had done their homework. They were just there to lobby for their own thing and say it's the future of the country. So I don't know. Then there's a debate about whether you should stay in a catch-up economy or you should be at the frontier. And I don't have the answer. Draghi actually wants to extend the the important programs of common interest, European interests. Yes, I forgot the E. That's terrible. So he said, well, maybe in principle they are for breakthrough innovation, for disruptive technology. Why don't we extend them to the catch-up logic? I don't know. That's if you have a view on that, I will be taking it. I don't have to tell you, we live in a more brutal world. Geopolitics are increasingly transactional. It's not new. I mean, they've always been for millennia transactional. But I mean, here, if you compare with 2 years ago, that has become more transactional. Hirschman, a long time ago, wrote a book in which he stressed the benefit of multilateralism to avoid transactional geopolitics and reliance, both agreement across countries on some rules and reliance not to be too exposed to certain imports. And actually, that's the way he invented the HHI. So that was already there. But now, of course, we have the situation where you have two countries, and Europe has recreated its own fragility, I must say. So we have more concentrated industries and supply chains. So in the space between perfect competition and regulated monopolies, the old-style telecom and whatnot, monopoly regulation, you have, of course, antitrust. And that's, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to have expanded with a couple of things which have to do with scale effect in the new economy. Multi-sided platforms, of course, we see a lot of that. But semiconductor, if you look at semiconductor and you have lots of different players at different points in the supply chain, those actually many have monopolies on the high-end segment, sub-segment, okay? More than 90% of market share. In Europe, we have ASLM, right? who actually procures the optics from Zeiss only. Um, Manufacturing, TSMC, and so on. I mean, you can go on and on. And the point is that you get a lot of monopoly along thing. So if you look at, for example, in semiconductor, the supply chain, who is present on that space? Well, you see almost everywhere the US and China. Okay, they're almost everywhere. They're kind of self-reliant, not quite. Um, but then outside that thing, I mean, you have Germany in some places, you have Netherlands with ESLM, but by and large, you see how vulnerable we are to a breakdown in the supply chain, and therefore we are vulnerable to blackmail, right? Okay, now you might say, okay, in biomedicine, we are doing better. And to some extent, that's true. We are doing better in pharmaceutical products than in tech. If you look at the big firms, for example. But for how long? And that will be my worry. For how long? Because as you all know, the borders between tech and biomedicine are blurring. And it turns out that China and the US have big edge. They have the data, they have AI, they have genetics, they have STEM, they have huge amount of STEM trained people, which we kind of neglect. The US had made up by importing those STEM people from abroad, basically. But this is a huge, not to mention money. I forgot to put money in there because, of course, all those firms have plenty of cash. Now, the European innovation ecosystem has the same weaknesses as in tech. There are issues with health data centralization. Actually, Europe, at the domestic level, I don't know every country, but if you look at France, France is very good at mixing data and supplying the data on many things from the hospitals and so on, but then it stopped at the border of France. There's no mixture of data with the German data and all the 25 other data sets. Now, China, of course, is pretty centralized. US, it's still very fragmented for data, except if they belong to Google and Apple and Meta. But that's prioritized, so it's not as good. So there, it's not like we like completely behind, but there's still a worry. Now, where we lag behind, for good or bad reasons, I'm not taking a normative approach, is the regulatory approval process. So take the case of targeted therapies. The patent protection is incredibly weak there because there are many keys which can open the same lock. And people estimate that the effective patent protection, the patent protection is still 20 years, but the effective patent protection is about 3 years. Now, if you have patent protection of 3 years, going very fast through your process is actually a big advantage. And in the China, for example, you have very rapid approval process. So if the agency in charge, the FDA, I don't know the name of the Chinese FDA, but is going to approve very fast. If it doesn't respond, that means that the clinical test is basically a process is approved. Now, there's also a difference in terms of budget. So, we have been studying Horizon Europe, which is supposed to be the European DARPA. I will say a few words about that. But if you think about Horizon Europe, for most of the fields of science, is 13 billion euros. NIH, I still think it's the case despite Trump, there are like $48 billion per year for health in the health space. So if you look at those numbers, you just say, there is something wrong. Now, I told you that, by the way, I told you that the public was spending as much in the US as, as in Europe, the public sector. So how do you explain that? Well, it's very simple. In Europe, 90% of the R&D, public R&D budget is managed by the member states. Not in the US. In the US, it's at the federal level. It's not Oklahoma, which actually finances R&D directly, right? So that explains, there's much more power for that in the US. So there, if you look at all that, it basically tells you, are we going to, is the same thing going to happen in biotech as in tech? And the current number says yes, it's going to happen. If you look at clinical trials in China, for example, 5 years ago they were nowhere. Now the clinical trials in China is basically almost at the US level or something like that. So basically you are going to have a duopoly again. Where is Europe? Okay. So we have to think about how to improve things. We have to think about regulation. Yeah, there is always the joke about Europe being a regulatory giant and an innovation midget or something like that. I don't know what the exact quote, but there's nothing wrong with being a regulation giant as long as we do the right kind of regulation, as we don't do bureaucracy, but actually try to promote innovation in some way while respecting privacy and so on. So we have to think about, the approval process for targeted therapies is not at all the same and should not be the same as for regular drug. Virtual twins, there have been already arrangements to accommodate virtual twins. So this is the kind of thing we need to think about and do it better than other countries. The other thing that worries me, and that's not about innovation directly, is what's going to happen to drug prices in Europe. So I don't know, France wants to reduce drug prices. Now, this I understand. They are 1/4 of US prices. Now, as you know, there's been discussion for a long time in the US to have an MFN. So basically, use, and Trump has designated a basket of countries for that. But are we going to keep 1/4 of the US price when the pharmaceutical companies will have to apply the same prices more or less in the US? The answer is no. So, I'm not saying we should pay through the nose and spend a huge amount of medicines. We have trade-offs. We don't, in France, not in Germany, but in France, we have a number of medicines which are missing because they are too expensive, because we want to give the medicine to everyone. That's perfectly respectable. So, in France, you cannot even, if you are rich, you cannot even pay for those new medicines. But that's fine, I would think. But the problem is that it's going to become harder and harder because with an MFN, that's going to mean that we are going to forego more and more medicines because they will be way too expensive. The pharmaceutical companies will have a bigger bargaining power with respect to France. Okay? So that brings me to the new mantra. Okay? The new mantra is, should we do more industrial policy, which is, and it's on the rise. Competition policy is in retreat. You may have different views. There is a little bit of truth in that statement. I don't think, as you might imagine, I don't even understand this sentence because as long as you haven't told me what industrial policy is, what can you say? And I think the debate between competition policy and industrial policy is a false debate. We have had all along industrial policy everywhere. I mentioned those things. So, it can be targeted, non-targeted. I mean, I tend to call industrial policy more the targeted intervention. So a carbon tax or a tax credit on R&D or uniform tariffs will be non-targeted, for example. That may or may not qualify as industrial policy, but they don't have the same nature. In principle, targeted policy is more efficient. For example, we could just target the stuff away from automobiles and more into innovative biotech, for example. So it targeted IP, but it requires humility or humbleness. I don't know, but it requires not not pretending to know what's going on. Um, then, even if you do industrial policy, at some point you need competition there. If you do industrial policy and you have crony industrial policies, so you give it to your friends, which is often the case, um, that's not competition. It's not, the best are not going to emerge. If you do it, what we do often in Europe with Sprinkle, you give a little bit of money to everyone. That's, by the way, a lot of the activity of Horizon Europe is like this. You sprinkle. So each team has a little bit of money. And because every team will have money, there's no competition either. You receive money. So that's not great. And then if industrial policy is poorly informed, that's bad as well. So that was the second point. The third point is that, and of course, I don't think many people are going to disagree in this room, but lots of people will disagree outside that room, which is that industrial policy, competition policy is a form of industrial policy. If industrial policy is meant to increase productivity, then competition policy operates to increase productivity in many ways. Competition offers benchmarkings, so good for managerial incentives. It relocates market share toward the most efficient firms, and that's actually a very important effect empirically. Then we can break up monopolies, and we can provide open standards, regulation of access. So here we are from 1984 AT&T to the DMA, for example. Okay, so what kind of industrial policy that really what matter? Now, why is competition policy under attack? So if you read the Draghi report and many reports, it's about scale effects. You have scale economies, and they exist, and I'm going to come back to that. There are scale effects. The modern version, which is also dynamic competitiveness, is also in the Draghi report, is to encourage innovation. And finally, there will be, for societal goals. So you want to basically the view that competition policy is focused on competition and not on other goals which are important for countries. Okay, so there are the three things, and I would like to make a few comments regarding this. So one of the criticism of competition policy is that it doesn't allow the firms to enjoy the scale effects. So therefore, you should, for example, merge firms so that they have a minimum scale to compete with the Chinese and American giants. You need to create a thing. And that was the case for the Alstom-Siemens merger. Of course, that requires that there is actually international trade and no barriers no tariffs and non-price barriers to entry. Because the argument is really you have to compete with those guys. Now, scale matters. I mean, if you look at the platforms like Google and so on, you clearly know that scale matters. There are network externalities and the like. You have more incentive to innovate also because you have a bigger market. I'll come back to that. But if you look at the US, and you can contradict me, but my view is that Google and Apple and so on benefited a huge amount from public money. They owe a lot of public money. But the kind of public money there that they benefited from was mostly upstream money in terms of knowledge that was created by the public sector. Or semi-public, like Xerox PARC, which which was obviously private, but it's kind of semi-public. Um, not from subsidies to firms, by and large. Now, is competition policy so strict? So, people will disagree, will say in a decade starting in 2010, there were only 9 mergers blocked out of 3,000 roughly in the EU. I think it's even lower number since 2020, and as those who know, I think it has gone down still in percentage, right? You let me know if I'm wrong, but so now you might say, okay, 9 mergers is not that much, but there are lots of mergers which were not even proposed because of that. So it might be more than 9 actually, if you think about it. The counterfactual we don't know. Now you could make a couple of arguments. The first is that the scale effects can be overestimated. So it can be cross-section or time series. So with learning by doing, of course, you become more and more efficient over time, but and your scale increases also. So there is a natural correlation as opposed to causality between learning, between scale and efficiency. On cross-section, it may be the case that being large means that you simply have lower costs. It's not big. You start with lower costs and therefore you're larger. You have bigger market share, as opposed to the other causality, which will be basically if you are large, you get lower cost. But I mean, there are enough people who know about mergers analysis here that I'm not going to risk anything. But the thing is not that easy to measure scale effects. Okay. Now, another counter-argument is that you have some countries which are very small, don't have a huge domestic market, which actually are doing pretty well in R&D. Okay, so you may not need to have a big market. What do I make out of that? I'm not sure. I mean, it's also important to have a domestic market in the end, but it shows that it's actually more complicated. Innovation often comes from small firms. Big firms are afraid of cannibalizing their activities. It's well known. Then why do you need to merge? Can you do some licensing, cooperate, create a joint venture? Okay, what's the point there? And then probably the welfare effects depend very much on whether you have a reduction in fixed costs or reduction in marginal cost during the merger. Okay? Now, it's pretty clear that monopolies do not always innovate. I mean, Google was doing extremely well in AI. It's just anecdotal, I'm not sure. There's nothing scientific in what I'm going to say. But Google was doing pretty well in AI, and in the end, it's okay. But the issue is that, of course, Google was making a huge amount on search, and with AI, you can do basically duplicate Google and bookings and all those things very easily. So, I mean, you still have to do it well, and it takes time to build a consumer base and so on. But I would say Google was not very much in a hurry to innovate in AI, given that it had already a very profitable market which will be cannibalized. Now, Google doesn't have a choice anymore. Anyway. Now, I mean, it's pretty clear. So what does this imply for merger control analysis? So Mario Draghi suggests, I mean, he's aware of the issue that there will be every merging firms will basically be claiming big efficiency gains. And he says, I think rightly so, that the burden of proof should lie with emerging firms. Then he mentioned that the emerging firms should commit to a certain level of investment, maybe innovation, for example, innovation investment. There, I'm less keen on accepting the argument because of several things. The first is the counterfactual. Maybe they would have done more innovation than they did before. Nobody knows because they had the incentive to innovate anyway. And then there's the other thing is what about creative accounting? We all know about creative accounting. Um, what do you call innovation? And even for innovation, is that used for this product or this product? So it's pretty easy to actually manipulate that. And we, of course, don't want the market power that we have created through the merger to translate into more dividends or an easy life, even worse, an easy life for the management. So that's it. And then on top of that, you can argue if you allow the merger and we made a mistake, then it's going to be very hard to unscramble the eggs. Okay? So these are difficult fields, but again, many of you know much more than I do about the team. Okay, now when you talk about this, basically to policymakers, now they all know about the U-shape. Philip's prize, of course, help evangelize the thing, but the inverted U-shape curve, basically you need something in the middle to get the optimal level of innovation. You don't want a monopoly because a monopoly doesn't want to cannibalize itself, blah, 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 it's an easy life. But if you have too many firms, you may have an appropriability problem, which innovation are quickly imitated. I'm willing to believe that when you move from 1 to 2. If you have no competitor, you won't be imitated, maybe. So, basically the idea is that they obtain an N star, the optimal number of firms in their paper. And this is a very interesting paper because it really tells you there are trade-offs. But, if you ask me what is N star, it depends on IP protection because of the appropriability prime. It depends on the importance of innovation. What happens if there is a lack of competition and so on. So N star might be 2, N star might be 20. What do I know? So that's difficult. Maybe the authors have an answer to that. But we do see fierce competition in China and a lot of innovation too. So it's going to be a complicated issue, okay? But I think one of the merits of Philip and prestigious co-authors, I mean, there are 5 in this paper, so is to have said, we need at least some competition, right? That's pretty clear, and they've made it clear for that. Now, whether it's going to help us having 2 firms versus 20 firms, I have no clue. Okay, let me move on to a third attack on competition policy. And the third attack is the inclusion of societal goals. And John Vickers, a couple of years ago, had this funny title saying, "Should competition monopolize merger policy?" But, and by the way, standard setting policies. I mean, but, more and more, civil society and the politicians said, well, what are those stupid economists and lawyers who just think about competition narrowly defined? And, they haven't understood there was a world around them where there's pollution, there are poor people, we have perhaps low innovation that happens. We have supply chain vulnerabilities. We have financial instability. We have media concentration. We have et cetera, et cetera. So are we narrow people? I mean, that's the question. Are we narrow people? Of course, all are legitimate objectives. And by the way, what the politicians don't say is that there is huge political failure. There is a market failure every time, but there is also a huge political failure. And that's why people are worried. If the politicians did the right thing, we will not be worried about that. Carbon will be priced at the social cost of carbon, and then who cares? Okay? So, I found that disingenuous for politicians to complain that economists and lawyers are just narrow-minded, when in fact the reason for why they are primes is that they themselves don't do the job. Okay, so that's an issue. But let's take it for granted. There's a twin market failure and government failure. So we still have lots of primes, and that I'm not going to disagree with. And obviously, we have to do something about it. Okay. Now, you see a little bit of that intervention. So Martin, for example, has a paper where, for example, he notes the note that despite independence of competition authority, politicians, and Kenny can tell us a lot about this, politicians can use possible exemptions to impose their objective. It could be imposing conditions on merging parties. It could be allowing cartel agreements, all the things we love. Cartel agreements in agriculture or culture, of course, so basically so far in agriculture, if you have sustainability objective or you want to promote small firms or improve safety condition or whatnot, okay, allow a cartel. Now, whether the cartel is going to do it, it's going to take commitments maybe, but well. So there's been some debate about the objective function. There is a way of incorporating efficiency gains, not only technical efficiency gain, cost-based, but also other things like the environment or things like that. But let me remind you that basically competition authorities have the tradition to be a consumer advocate. That doesn't mean that the competition authorities are not going to take innovation into account. It's already part of their mandate. But in the end, the idea is that you defend the consumer, and it may be the case that defending firms sometimes may also be good for the consumer. Okay. Now, the balancing, unlike a social planner, the social planners can say, okay, here's the gain in terms of the cost in terms of market power, and here's again in terms of reduction in pollution. Now, you have a narrower definition, which has to do with, okay, are the consumers in this particular district or country going to gain from that? So that came up in the Volvo-Scania case, for example, where, of course, Volvo-Scania merger was not very good for the Scandinavian countries, but that could be different with Europe. Or if you think about the UK, for example, if you want to take into account reduction in pollutions, you just have to look at what's happening in the UK, which is less than 1% of pollutions. So what happens to the 99% remaining, right? So the question is a question about which jurisdictional level you apply it to. Same thing, if your objective is fair trade, sustainable cotton, or something like that. Okay, so there are difficult things. Something I want to discuss where, I'm an old-style person, Tinbergen person, which, I grew up with, say, okay, you have one instrument per objective. With Matthias, the Watt Reports, and Ian Jewett, a bit mainly Matthias, we develop some more foundations for that. But I think it's important if you want to have a clear mission, to have one instrument, one objective corresponding to one particular thing is good. Now, it doesn't mean that competition authorities cannot take into account climate change, for example. If you do have a price for carbon, then you can aggregate social welfare with the issue about would you count the world social welfare or just the social welfare of the country. There's this issue. But at least you have weights. The weight is the price of carbon. You can completely aggregate, and there is no point. There is no prime actually extending the mission of the competition authority because it's under control. Let me give you the opposite case. France and a number of other countries, I just know Greece, but I'm sure there are others, have made it mandatory that public authorities, like local authorities, for example, will have to include environmental consideration into procurement. So that when there is an auction for procurement, the small town or the region have to include the impact on the environment. Okay, and I'm going to come to that because it seems to me that reopens the door to corruption and clientelism. Because you don't define, I mean, let me say it right now. First, you don't define what the price of carbon is. So that means that some local authorities are going to take €1 per ton, some others are going to take €1,000 per ton, depending on what they want to achieve. Either whether they are green or not, but also which firm they want to select. Terrible. If that said, okay, €100 is a price, fine. But they don't even say what price. What is the value of carbon? Okay? And then, and I'll say that again in a minute, they don't have any measure instrument. So how do you, so the firms are going to tell you, I import my tomatoes from Spain, here is the cost in terms of transportation, or I did in Toulouse and it's in a warehouse, so there was meeting expenses. And I'm going to give you a number. And basically the local authority is going to accept or not accept that number, but it doesn't have any staff to do that. So this is very bizarre. I mean, it's much easier. I mean, first, if you really want, if you want to solve the energy transition issue, use a proper instrument. Carbon pricing, breakthrough innovation, green innovation, and many other things that you can do to reduce carbon emission in an efficient way. Okay? Now, just destroying public procurement procedure is not the right way to do that. Okay? That's not being green, in my view. It's not being green because you're not going to succeed in your objective. It's going to be very expensive. So let me just summarize the 4 objections to broadening the mandate. The first I already mentioned, the lack of capability. You need a staff to verify emissions. As I say in the case of carbon emission claims, you need a methodology. How much leakage, what is the price of carbon, and so on. And you have the right instruments, okay? Then the tendency is really to get everyone to do something about the environment. I know we are desperate, and that's correct. But the point is that we ask every agency on Earth in the country to actually do something about it. So you are going to ask the competition authority, you're asking the ECB, you're asking courts, various levels of courts in the system to take into account green policy. You're asking lots of people are going to do that, and why not the World Bank and the IMF and so on. So who is in charge? So there are too many cooks in a sense, and on top of that, they don't have the right instruments. They are not doing carbon pricing. They are not doing, they may do some in procurement, but by and large, they're not doing carbon pricing. They are not doing breakthrough innovation and so on. Then is what we have been working on also with Matthias and Andrew on the economic missions. And something I strongly believe in, and I was worried about that with the ECB during the Greek car crisis. Fortunately, it worked out. But it's going to be, if the agencies start going into the political domain, then you are going to end up with the loss of independence. You are supplying a good argument for those who don't want independent agencies to take over. And I'm very concerned about that. And then at some point, you also want governments to assume their responsibility. Okay. Okay, let me skip the foreign competition because I'm going to, because I would like to have some exchange to be perhaps more interesting for you and me. So the third part of this talk will be about the way we do industrial policy. And here I'm going to take a precise definition of industrial policy is Horizon Europe, okay, which is the innovation agency for Europe. So in that report I mentioned earlier, we argued that Europe invests too little in the wrong industries and with the wrong governance. It's a little bit strong, right? But let's be a bit provocative. And that's so wrong industry, by the way. I mean, after all, if we are good in mid-tech, which I have some doubts about, maybe in the for Airbus, maybe we are good. But cars, are we that good in cars? Given that we put 1/3 of the research budget of firms, private firms, into cars. When you see the outcome, you say, so anyway, so we invest too little. I already said that. The wrong industries is another table. It's not scientific, but just to give you some picture. So if you look at 23 years ago, in the US, the biggest firms were Cars and Pfizer. It's pretty simple. Also in Europe, it's very similar, except that was Cars plus Siemens. Okay, and then you look at 2022. The big firms in the US are all, I mean, you can add some others about, but it's basically tech firms. And then when you see in Europe, they're automotive firms, right? And there is something that has gone wrong, okay? And with all due respect for my German friends. Well, I mean, France is not that different, right? So the Horizon Europe is not, contrary to politicians have told you, it's not DARPA or NARPA, I should say. When we looked at that, about 5% of this small number, 30 billions, of the Horizon Europe program was supporting disruptive innovation. Very, very little. So, with a few hundred million euros, you're not going to go very far in tech and biotech. The money which is spent is on high TRLs, so it's the TRLs for DARPA maybe 3 or 4. We are more in the 5, 6, 7 range. And the money, the open money, basically is about subsidizing SMEs. Again, I'm being provocative. But if you want the big picture, we are subsidizing SMEs. Nothing wrong with that, but don't call that a DARPA. Okay? Now, something that can be done very easily, but probably will be the hardest to do, is to change the governance. It's very cheap to change the governance, but the resistance is tremendous. So today, we have a political governance in Europe. Of course, we have scientists who actually help select projects. So they are scientists, but they are not the ones who decide. It's not like DARPA. The ones who decide are the civil servants and the politicians. Okay? Consequence, the first is that they may not get scientific which are as good. We did something nasty. We compare the scientists, the CVs of scientists in the panels of the ERC, which actually this is an area where the scientists decide. That's the one exception, which, by the way, is under attack. The current news are good, but And then the other programs, you compare the CVs, they're not the same, as you might predict, because if you don't decide, you know, you ask me, do I want to work for the ARC? If the ARC is anyway, the decision will be done by politicians, not for me. That's kind of logical. Um, I mean, the CVs are not bad. I mean, surprisingly good compared, given the circumstances, I would say, the CVs of people who are involved in Horizon Europe, but clearly not as good as the CVs of the panels in ERC. So there are consequences. So if you are European politicians, you want to create Europe. At least if you work for the European Commission or if you work for the council members, and you want to create Europe, which is a good goal, a very nice goal, actually. But then they want to be the ones who are going to create Europe. So they create collaborations. Okay? They insist, except the RC again, they insist on collaboration of across countries, a minimum number of countries and teams and so on, to basically create Europe. Now, it's not only scientists, it's also firms. They know with whom they want to work, right? It's not Europe which is going to create those teams. Otherwise, the people are completely incompetent, right? The firms or the scientists who we know with whom we would like to work. And same thing for the firms. So that means that we don't need Europe to basically be a matchmaker, but in the process, because they are going to get a lot of collaboration, then they will sprinkle the money. So they will give a little bit of money to each, which I told you is bad. That I've mentioned. And then we discovered there are also very few program managers, maybe 1/10 of the number at DARPA. The consequence of that is that even a good person may not master all the scientific field. I think there were about 10, I don't remember what we put in the report, but about 10 program members. But now the fields of science are many, and if you're an expert in quantum physics, you don't know anything about what other physicists are doing by and large. It has become so specialized that so you don't have enough program managers. And on top of that, those program managers, they lack the authority, the flexibility in writing quickly contracts. There's no trust in them, compared to the DARPA people who actually can jumpstart things very fast. And then, the usual thing about Europe is that you don't trust people, so you put lots of constraint ex ante, as opposed to accountability where you do trust people, and then you see exposed if they have abused. And that's a difference in mentality, which everybody will tell you, the money comes slowly. Okay? And, if you are in a race for technology and your money comes a year later, even that can be very bad. I told you the European R&D budget is very small. It's 10% of the public funding in Europe. Now you might say the breakthrough innovation happens at the domestic level. It's very unlikely, both theoretically because there's more corruption somehow at the domestic level than at the European level, simply because people know each other much better. It's not that Europe domestic people teams are more corrupt. It's simply that they know everybody knows each other at home. And my impression is that the national programs are not much more focused on breakthrough innovation. So Antonin Berger, for example, has written a paper on the French research tax credits, which is very large. It's very big. And in the end, it benefits basically the automotive and airline industry, which are more mid-tech industries. On average, I mean, there's a continuum of things, and even within automobile, they have actually tech segments, right? So it's actually complicated. But by and large, it's very unlikely that there's more disruptive innovation at the French level than say at the European level. Okay, here is something I'm going to ask for your help because with the IPCEI, I don't know that much about it, but it seems something that we as economists should also be studying. It's very important because that's industrial policy. A couple of features, and you'll you'll prove me wrong later on, but my view of that is that basically the ambition is to have additionality, which means that you want to finance projects that will not have taken place elsewhere otherwise. Um, so, and with the benefit, say for example, on supply chain resilience or something like that, which applies to the entire Europe. And on principle, why not? I mean, if it turns out that we cannot have hydrogen, for example, emerging unless you put countries, an industry which I've studied is antibiotics. It's pretty clear that the market incentive for antibiotics is very small for various reasons, but the minimum scale to basically have the money to finance new antibiotics is Europe. It's not the UK or France or sorry, and so on. So the way it works is it's a coalition of the willing. So you don't have uh, to operate there, and then you have a relaxation of stated rules. Okay. By the way, it's financed by the countries themselves. So the French are going to finance French firms. So it's not like you take from the European budget so much. And the governance is very much top-down, which is very different from other industrial policies which are based, say DARPA, for example. DARPA is top-down because it's defense. You need to, there's a demand side which is public. But still, there's a lot of bottom-up aspects. And here, basically the states select the project, the firms, and DG Comp is basically trying to check if there's an issue with competition. Okay, and very limited, even compared to Horizon Europe, it's very limited role of scientists. So if you have any information or if you know of studies which have studied that, I realize it's recent and it's a small number, but if you have case studies on that, I will really know about it. I want to know about it. And let me finish with that. There are lots of recommendations, in Letta and Draghi report, which make a lot of sense. I'm not going to cover them. There's one which I want to emphasize, and actually I'm not the one who thought about it, is the labor market institution and what they do to innovation in Europe. What COST and COETLM do is basically to try to have a rough measure of how much it costs to relocate or fire the workers in Europe. Forget about Switzerland and Denmark, but by and large, Germany, France, and so on, it can take, with all the costs, not only severance pay, all the costs, which are many when you have a command and control thing. It could be easily 24 or 48 months of pay. In the US, it's more like 6 months. In China, probably 0. I don't know. But, it's now we may say, okay, we want to protect workers, that's fine. But think a bit about it. We are going to protect workers who are highly skilled engineers, who are relatively rich relative to the population, and have a lot of outside of. So if you are in Paris and you're 30-year-old and you lose your job with Mistral, you can go and work almost anywhere and find a job the next day. Now, do you need those institutions actually to protect the worker? I know that Germany is thinking, and again, you could tell more about this, of having limited employment protection for high-wage workers. But let me say, it's not just on the cost of firms, it's there on their strategy. If you want to do disruptive innovation, 80% of the time you are going to fail. That means you have to change, the way Meta switched from the metaverse to AI. You fire 20,000 people, and then you hire 10 or 20,000 people in another field. Okay? Is that doable in Europe? I'm not saying it's desirable, but Is that doable? The answer is no. It will be so expensive. So you keep doing, even if you are failing in that dimension, you keep doing things. But if you work by backward induction, you notice that, of course, you are much better off doing incremental innovation. You have probability 20% of failing, not 80%. So that introduces a big bias. So the firms are incentivized actually not to take risky strategies. And that also contributes to the fact that we are trapped in the mid-tech environment. Okay, let me stop here. I'm sure you have lots of things to comment on and object to, but I want to thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor.